Good afternoon. You're all very welcome to our In Conversation event with Professor John Paul Lederach. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Lederach virtually to Queen's University and the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. I wish to thank the Mitchell Institute and its director, Professor Hastings Donnan, for his support of this event. As some of you know, Professor Lederach also spoke on Sunday in an event at the Four Corners Festival. So I'll reiterate what I said when I introduced him on Sunday. Professor Lederach really needs no introduction. He is Professor Emeritus of International Peacebuilding at the University of Notre Dame, USA, and a Senior Fellow at Humanity United, a foundation dedicated to cultivating the conditions for enduring freedom and peace. He's a world-leading expert on conflict transformation and the author of some 22 books. And his work has been informed by his personal faith and a deep knowledge of Christian scriptures, and has influenced the way we have thought about conflict transformation in Northern Ireland. So throughout the course of the afternoon, I'm going to start with a conversation with Professor Lederach, but your questions will be invited as we get towards the end of the program. So as we go along, please do write your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and giving you an opportunity to pose your questions as well. So Professor Lederach, I want to start our conversation by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your life before you became active in peacebuilding work. So specifically, how did growing up in Mennonite communities in the United States influence your interest in peacebuilding?
Well, thank you, Gladys, and greetings to everyone out there. I can see a few faces, but I'm sure there are many more. So my growing up years were in the far Northwest, and then some traveling our family did for various reasons related to my parents' education primarily, that took us across from Oregon to Indiana, North Carolina, Kansas. So a number of places that we grew up. With a rare exception, those were often proximate to and within local Mennonite communities. My parents, my grandparents have been pastors and leaders within the Mennonite church. For me, I think that those cohered more in a more conscientious way as I came into my teenage years, which would have coincided with roughly the latter half of the decade of the 1960s into the early 70s, when I was moving from high school into college, which was, as you know, in the United States, a period of the civil rights movement. A lot of the soundscape for me was voices like, the Kennedys and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that would have been sort of behind us. Internally in our community, I gravitated, obviously, much more to the people that were taking on the ethics of social responsibility in reference to themes like war, peace, nonviolence, injustices, and how to develop better relationships across the systems that have often excluded and created discrimination. And of course, I was in a family. My parents they may in fact be on here somewhere. They were people who have lived in Belfast for blocks of time. So many of you know who they are that may be on this call. They were in particular very much open about these conversations and participated in various ways, particularly when we lived in North Carolina, around issues of the racism and the stances that they took. Our family often had people from very different backgrounds coming in and out of our homes, both across racial lines. My mom's family grew up actually on the Texas border, so was bilingual from her younger years. And we often had connections with people coming from Spanish-speaking background that would have been coming through Oregon, for example, as migrant workers or other things. So a lot of that was the ethos that for me really drove, at the point at which I was 18, 17, needing to make a decision about the conscription in the United States and the Vietnam War. Even though my birth date that was chosen would not have had me obligated, I ended up doing going into voluntary service for 3 years internationally, stopped between my sophomore and junior year. And that was, I think, driven a lot by the impulse of wanting to live into what I understood to be the faith perspective that placed emphasis on the sanctity of life in many regards, the pacifist tradition, but that pacifism, while for some within our wider denomination tends to be pulling back and away so that we're kind of the quiet in the land, as they sometimes say. For me, it was the opposite direction. It was what really does that call you to be and do in reference to the biggest issues in the world. So by the time I was 18 to 20, those early experiences cohered around some choices such that when I completed my university work, I sought out very specifically conflict and peace studies programs that were only very nascent at that time. They're just beginning. There were not very many that you could find. And in my case, it was a small Mennonite college that had an undergraduate major. So I had a major in history and peace studies. And I've never left that field. That's what I pretty much committed to from very early on as kind of a vocation. I've always felt lucky or blessed, I'm not sure which it is, that things that I vocationally felt deeply connected to, I was able to find ways to translate those into meaningful work that permitted a livelihood. And our family's been at that ever since. So.
Yeah, that's interesting there how, you point out, I suppose, when you were getting your start as an undergraduate and then a graduate student, in some ways it was the beginning of the bigger development of the field of conflict resolution, conflict transformation. But of course, I suppose the Mennonite tradition within Christianity has always had that pacifist thrust. So that draws on even, I suppose, a centuries long history that then feeds into that wider developing academic field, and some very creative synergies, I suppose, have come out of that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've never, I certainly understand, but I've always felt that it's significant to keep integrating the combination of the inner and the outer world that faith speaks to, but also that people who come from very different backgrounds these days might refer to as mindfulness or other kinds of ways that they proceed with that. But it's also true that integration is about a kind of an ethics of wanting to work in the direction of the support of human dignity, and how much conflict creates, periods where very intensely we see the lack of human dignity in the systems that have evolved that we're trying to change, but also in how we treat each other. And this notion of pacifism only really makes sense if you're developing alternatives to violence, not just that you are pulling back and away from being involved in it. And that, for me, now I can't speak on behalf of everyone within the Mennonite tradition. There are many that would probably move the opposite direction in some regards, as is the case in many denominational situations. But for me, that impulse was that it had to find ways to interact with the messiness of the world. And that was very much what I was interested in, finding ways to understand and to practice in one form or another.
Yeah, and I mean, as you well know, religion can be a controversial subject when it comes to conflict and conflict transformation. And in your 1997 book, Building Peace, Sustainable Reconciliation in Divided Societies, that's been one of the most influential in the field of conflict transformation. So much so, I'm still assigning it to students in the classes I teach here at Queen's. And in that, you develop a conceptual framework for reconciliation that's based around Nicaraguan mediators' use of the 85th Psalm. And in that, you describe reconciliation as this place where truth, justice, mercy, and peace meet. So I was wondering if more than 20 years on from that book, could you reflect on how you've seen that framework taken from a very, I suppose, Christian context applied in other contexts? And could you comment on whether there's cases when the framework's explicitly Christian origins have been helpful or, perhaps even a hindrance?
Yeah. Well, maybe a small note, first of all, to give some flavor of how the wider field and the language of the field, but also Outside of the field of peace studies, the language has significantly evolved from that period where that started for me in the 1980s, which actually, Gladys, with this gray hair is pointing to something closer to 40 years back when that would have first emerged, although it wasn't written at that point. When I first wrote this manuscript, it was submitted to a publisher. It was an international publisher. And it went through an editorial process that was very unusual. I was a relatively new writer, so I didn't always know all the things that were happening behind the scenes, to be honest. But it came, so the editing was done without consultation with me, and it was published and then sent back to me. And when I received the book, I opened it up and they had changed the title. And the title got shifted from Sustainable Reconciliation to Sustainable Development, which indicated in the conversation that I had with them, because I immediately objected, and they pulled the whole volume. They tried to republish it, and then eventually they pulled it again because we had a lot of issues around the editing. But the core of what was happening was that the concept of reconciliation was so foreign to people in the context of working with both international and internal, but highly weaponized conflicts, the Civil War kind of situations, that their terminology reverted to development rather than reconciliation. They assumed that I had made a mistake. So they corrected it, which for me was very reflective of how far one had to go. In the writing of that book, while I used Psalm 85 and the story of where that emerged, which was around people who were, it was an interreligious, interdenominational team of mediators working in the Sandinista Mosquito Indian conflict in the east coast of Nicaragua, where that first came up, the use of Psalm 85. What I found relevant about that, I didn't go into, in the book, into the deeper theological notions that may pertain, but rather was pulling that these four voices represent, almost embodied, represent the energies that are a part of a conflict. And we find that to be true now, many, many years later, how much these remain a big part of the challenges that face people moving through violent conflict and into some form of coming out of that through a peace agreement or by other means. So you have truth commissions. So the psalmist was saying truth and mercy have met together, justice and peace have kissed. That was the four terms, but they were embodied terms. In other words, truth was like a person, mercy was like a person, justice, etc. That embodiment indicated the direction of something that walks and talks and has a voice. It was like an energy, a social energy that's present. And what you find very consistently in these conflicts is that these voices are always present. There will be sets of people advocating that nothing can happen until we have a full account of what did happen. In other words, we have an unveiling of the truth of who did what and how it transpired and what the motivations were. And that has to have a public rendition that has to be brought forward. So I'm serving right now as a kind of an advisor to the Colombian Truth Commission. And that's precisely what they're attempting to look back across 50 years of war. Mercy often has taken more of the forms. People often don't recognize that from a secular standpoint. So that term, especially in Spanish, it's a very curious term in Spanish that would be very much tied to more of a religious ethos. But it often is about compassion or some form of permitting a person to start again, which translates into the questions of amnesty, which then come into conversations about forgiveness and about impunity. And you have a whole range of stuff that begin to emerge that is not necessarily tied to a religious viewpoint, but is very much a part about the social ethos. Justice, of course, is about how you make things right. Reparations, accountability, what one has to do to repair what has been damaged, what one owes to those who have been hurt or to the society that's been hurt. Justice has taken so many forms over the last 40 years, the rise, for example, of restorative justice compared to retributive justice. These all, I think, are much more mainstream now than they were. Peace, obviously, has always been a big part of the discussion. It has ways that it has been brought into greater sophisticated, I think, understandings. So to answer your question, the way both that it was written, but also the way that it interacts with the ethos and the places where people are struggling with these, the thematic emphasis has always been relevant, and people did not need to have the direct connection to a religious understanding in order to see it. There were both secular ways that those things were expressed, but where that was present, I found that because it was located in the Psalms, it was much more in line with Hebrew-based traditions of writing. And by virtue of that, it had a kind of a similar resonance across the Abrahamic tradition, certainly. So it wasn't tied exclusively to a Christian viewpoint. But I also found it very interesting that those themes were relevant in easily so in contexts that didn't directly share any of that connection, simply bringing forward the notion that these are very live and real energies. I remember doing an exercise similar to what we did in Nicaragua with a bunch of diplomats from Eastern Europe, many of whom were coming from extreme secular viewpoints. And those, it was not hard at all to take the theme and embody it into a discussion of how, you know, something like the pursuit of justice is interacting with truth and some form of amnesty or peace, and where the pitfalls are on each, and where, when they're missing, what happens. And the biggest issues, of course, are always around people's understanding of the sequencing, which I somewhat make a case, although I'm maybe a bit of a minority voice, that pure sequencing is not possible in the real world. You don't just do truth and then you've done it and you move away. It remains, that memory remains a part of you. It doesn't disappear. And so the notion that you have first A, then B, then C, and then you get a good result, that kind of linear formulaic approach does not correspond to the fact that these are dynamics interacting with each other, and how we make those relevant and available, and where we notice the gaps of what needs to be lifted forward are really the challenges that we have in any context.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what you said there about pure sequencing not being possible in the real world. I mean, I know that's one of the points I always try to get through when I'm teaching courses on conflict and peace processes. And the story you told at the beginning as well about how the concept of reconciliation at that point was so alien that they literally just removed it from during the editing process. And you sort of have described how concepts like reconciliation and truth and justice have become more mainstream in the field. And I think a comment you made about how when you're in any context, you can find people who are talking about these issues. And to me, that sounds like it was almost an empirical necessity that these issues had to bubble up to the surface due to people's experience on the ground. So I wonder, am I interpreting you right, or could you just comment on that aspect as well?
No, absolutely. You know, I think that what you refer to as empirical demand or evidence is precisely the point, that the concern. So where there's been deep human harm done, people who think, I'll go to Colombia for a moment because it's much on my mind these days. There's a whole commission on the disappeared, people that literally were there one day and they're no longer there. Their families and their significant network want to know what happened, where their remains were, what were the last days of their life like, what was the the process. That these remain big gaps of understanding and knowledge, and that often translates into the push for truth. That is, that the empirical push is there's observable. So empirical would mean we observe that this is a part of the human need to understand the inexplicable, the unspeakable. And that's part of what that impulse toward truth is doing. At the same time, people are very cognizant that they don't want another 50 years of the same stuff. So how do we get this not only stopped, but how do we transform it into it not happening again. And that requires some kind of starting again. How do we, and then you begin to hear, again, you observe the push and the impulse to say, we can't live forever in the head of the Truth Commission in Columbia wrote a book just recently, the title of which translates to English as Imperfect Peace. We're not going to have perfection. So and who of us hasn't in one form or another participated in what produced all of this? And so this notion, but then that comes into deep discussions between that empirical impulse, if you will, and the justice one. Well, who's accountable? How do you bring repair to this? And those are the impulses that I think are always present. And anytime, one of the things I've discovered is whatever you choose to ignore in these situations is going to show up and knock at your door. So if you act like these things are not empirical, that is, that they aren't present, they're going to show up and they're going to make themselves known in one form or another. The question is how to create the space that they can interact more constructively and transparently and be attended to in ways that get to the depth of the impulse that they're really after. So quite often, if you've ignored something, like here in the United States, we've ignored truth for far too long. We had the largest genocides of any peoples in the world, the indigenous people. We lost more languages in the building of our country than any other place in the world. But there has never been a deep reckoning with what happened. We've had slavery as the way that entire peoples were brought to this nation, but we've never had a deep reckoning. So when you hear today about the notion of accountability and the impulse not only toward truth and justice, what you're seeing in that is that what was ignored is going to come forward because it does not disappear. And that I think is the challenge, is how to create that capacity for acknowledgement and interaction constructively and in ways that really attend to the impulses that are empirically there.
Yeah, and we'll come back, I'm sure, to the United States, later in the conversation. But the point about, what you try to ignore doesn't go away, and even just the examples you've given demonstrate that dynamic, I suppose, over centuries. But what I'd like to move on to now is to, I suppose, feed off what you talked about as well, about how do we bring repair to situations. And I think one of your distinctive contributions to the field of conflict transformation has been advocating creative and artistic approaches to peace building and reconciliation. So in a world where so much emphasis seems to be placed on political negotiations, can you describe how you became convinced of the importance of creative approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it was maybe my own personal crisis, which I won't go into all that now because there's no real need to have a trauma healing session for me right now in reference to this. But, there was a point in my life where I had a pretty significant near-death experience, and it really set me back and sent me into complete stillness for a while. Couldn't do anything, broken ribs and the whole kit and caboodle. And you start to raise some big questions around what all does this add up to, and is, peace. I sometimes say, sometimes peace builders are envious of bricklayers. If you're a bricklayer, at the end of the day, you at least see the wall or, the side of the house or the foundation that you built. You can kind of see the outcome. And when you're in peace building, you can sometimes go for decades, if not half centuries, and really wonder whether it has come to something significant. It was in that period, actually, that this bridge between art and, the book that came out of it was The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Building Peace. That was really where I started to articulate it much more deeply. And that notion of art and soul was about the fact that so many places where I had opportunity to engage with really significant relationships were places where people had suffered enormously. The level of violence that they had to face, whether structural and systemic, combined with open armed violence, created just a cauldron of human suffering. And so much of what they had experienced sat in what we could refer to as the world of the inexpressible. That is, that there is no real way to speak, to explain in sort of clear terminology analytically. To do that, you kind of move cold away from the human. You dehumanize it almost in order to speak it. And what is emergent around that quite often is that people often are trying to find ways to get at that. And those, I think, move much more to embodied ways of understanding the human experience. And by embodied, I mean that it touches on the different senses that we have. It's aesthetic in nature. Aesthetic, of course, is a Greek word that in its origins meant to be sharp in the senses. And to be sharp in aesthetics, we often tie into kind of the artistic world. But in reality, it's about how the senses are brought forward in so many ways. And what I found consistently was that the arts, and speaking very widely here when I use the word arts, could be from, medium that I tend to gravitate a bit more to is poetry, but it could be painting, it could be working with your hands in wood, it could be clay, it could be theater. Theater has been obviously a big one, but there's often a part in the artistic process that has elements that are so much about the things that we're trying to get at. One of those elements is how to find ways to unveil what is known but not seen, what is experienced or felt but not fully visualized. And art often brings forward in one form or another that process of unveiling and noticing. And then it places it out in a way where it permits people to have an interactive noticing. That is, that it touches into, it can sometimes bypass the need for perfect explanation and go more to the part of this, which is the landscape of the sensations, but also the landscape of our humanity and the landscape of our emotions. So much of conflict is not just about logical, rational, deliberation. That's kind of what negotiation tries to get to the best that it can. But often, the conflict is far more. I don't know what percentage you might tie to it, but 80, 90% sits in the emotional landscape. It sits in what you have learned to pay attention to, how you perceive the world, what you perceive is brought into an interpretive scheme, by which I mean you associate it with things. What I'm describing right there is aesthetic. It is that smell, sight, sound, taste. These are all things that are a part of what is emergent in that. And then as we cross from that capacity to unveil and notice and explore, we come into the process, which is also about how do we heal? How do we move forward when it seems impossible? How do I turn and look at somebody who has caused me harm? These I found increasingly that much of the field that I was in had a deep belief in the capacity to think it through clearly, and then the capacity to control it by some form of a design process. And that required a technical skill. So we became technicians of process. But in fact, many of the places where I was working, spontaneously, communities in particular, would often innovate things locally that were totally unexpected, but that opened up whole new ways of doing it. In other words, they were engaged in the creative process. And I began this notion that what if peace building more closely approximates the artistic process than the technicians, than the technical sort of skill process on the side of design. And I look back across my own career and noticed that while I was greatly privileged to have access to artists and myself be engaged in some forms of art, that was not a part of my formal training in this field. In fact, it was always portrayed that art might be an add-on, a kind of a peripheral, advanced way of doing things. My whole understanding began to shift that art sits the artistic process and the capacity for creativity sits at the center of transformational processes, not at the edges of it, in the sense that it is marginal or insignificant except for a few professionals. But it did require a small shift in mentality, which is not to think about the artist as Pablo Picasso, or Seamus Heaney. In other words, you pick somebody that's the brilliant end of everything that ever existed in that art form, and you say, well, I'm going to try to be. No, your effort is not to become something that you're not. It's to recognize the innate capacities within people, as particularly in small groups, to move in the direction of creativity based on the resources that they have within their own context and within their deepest understanding of their own experience, and how that has an element that will require us to engage in something that's creative, but that by virtue of that is emergent and not fully known as you begin. So you begin to have a whole different way of understanding the development of these processes that I felt was really significant.
Yes, and you referred there, I suppose, at the beginning of your answer to your personal experience, and you talk about that a bit in your book, When Blood and Bones Cry Out, and that has a subtitle, Journeys Through the Soundscape of Healing and Reconciliation. So there's an emphasis there on sound, and I have colleagues here at Queen's who are doing advanced research into how sound continues to influence conflict transformation scholarship. And where you've just described how you think the artistic element should be the center of conflict transformation processes, I suppose. To what extent do you think is that a minority view, or has that managed to gain some traction, I suppose, in that wider field of conflict transformation, that this real importance of the arts and arts happening at the grassroots?
Yeah, I think it's gaining traction. I'm not sure that it's at the, that it's at the front end of the train at this particular moment, but it is definitely, I think, on a growth curve in a lot of ways. The significance, of course, of just to take, how the field itself has expanded to so many different forms of exploration. The rise, for example, of the need to address transgenerational trauma and trauma healing, and that is not exclusively within a single individual, but that it's about wider collectives, whole societies that have experienced that, and how the field of trauma is, especially with transgenerational trauma, is not exclusively or best or perfectly suited by some form of individualized talk therapy. That is, you're going to try to arrive at an understanding, and that has evolved in many, many directions that have done it. The capacity of theater has been extraordinary in local communities, ways that, theater of the oppressed is probably the most well-known, taking these notions that how you create a mirror for communities to participate and look at the realities that they're in and explore the layers that are not always easy to do. Across to, I consistently think, obviously, I was, one of the impacts that I wrote about in the Moral Imagination was sitting in a conference that was held, if I remember correctly, in Enniskillen, where I was between chief of police and I believe the mayor at the time, and watching a dance troupe of, if I remember correctly, it was a mixed dance troupe of young women who were doing choreography to the song "The Island." Now, the thing was that the two people I was sitting beside had traversed years of the very dyed-in-the-wool, hard look at conflict. Chief of police, head of politics, etc. And both of them, at the conclusion of that 5 minutes, both of them leaned my direction separately and apologized for the tears that were running down their faces. because something was happening. Now, if you hear the description, because I remember it so vividly, you had a younger generation, you had choreography, you had body movement, you had behind on the screen the images of 30 years of troubles, and you had this melody and lyrics, music, all combined in one 5-minute slot. So it's like, it was like every one of your senses, with the potential difference of whether you had a tea, you might be tasting something. Every one of your senses seemed to be engaged at one time. And in reference to that, it opened you back up to your own and to others' humanity. In other words, it's like making the long trip back to humanity. We've lost sight of that. And I think this is a lot of, so in the book on the soundscape of healing and reconciliation, what we were noticing, because my daughter and I, Angie was the co-author, we were trying to pay very careful attention to how people talked about, how the language that they used to describe their own journeys with this. And quite often, one of the starting points across contexts and across languages was that violence always created a numbing effect. People felt deadened or numbed. So sound, in essence, relies on vibration. And violence is the removal of vibration. It had this numbing or deadening effect. And quite often people would say, and often they referenced a smell, a touch, a sound, a moment that was aesthetically described, in which in that moment, they felt for the first time, and then this phrase would come, like a person again. As if during the period that the violence was on top of them, they had lost their personhood. They were so numbed. And we felt this actually, there are a lot of metaphors that come, it's about, people might describe it as reconnecting with themselves, with voice not so much as power, but voice as feeling the vibration that something inside of me is starting to live again, right? Across to resonance, that sitting with someone else who told a story touched me. In other words, it's that crossing that happens as a voice goes out into the air and is brought back into the body. We know that sound, because it's based on vibration, is a whole body experience. We intake sound not just by way of our ears, but by way of all of our cells, which is why, again, Northern Ireland becomes very clear, why drumming in one form or another has such power, both in the rhythm and the sound and the expansiveness of why it is equally true that's the case in Africa in so many places. Why those rhythms and the beats and the body movement all are about the kind of things that come into reconnecting with a sense of connection and purpose and self and community. So there's a lot of powerful elements that go into that, but I think those were the ones that increasingly we saw in reference to that particular book. I'll be very interested to hear what your folks are doing in Queens. I had known some people are pursuing that. So if anybody's listening, write me with what you're doing on it. I'm curious. So.
Excellent. There's an invitation for you. So I'm going to shift gears slightly and take you back to your 1995 book, Preparing for Peace, Conflict Transformation Across Cultures. And that book laid theoretical and practical foundations for conflict mediation models. So I promised I was going to come back to the United States. So I wonder what your thoughts are on what do you think are the most important lessons from that work for mediators today in general, but also in particular, the context of racial divisions in the United States?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting to me because I think quite often when people in later years have approached my work, they've often approached it more through the book Building Peace, the little book of Conflict Transformation, and sometimes the Moral Imagination. Those tend to be often the avenues. This book was the first book that I published in English, coming out of the period of the 1980s, the Preparing for Peace book. And what it brings forward is based primarily on the work of Paulo Freire from Latin America, from Brazil. Freire's work was in education, but he was making a critique of traditional education and was making a proposal about education as a form of what he called conscientization, the awareness of self and context, and how people's everyday and natural knowledge is kind of a deep reservoir for being able to come to a more critical understanding of themselves and what they face, both personally and systemically, making no differentiation, that meaning that it's not one or the other, but it's a both and. But also this capacity for innovation and activating around what's being possible there. And I was applying this into my field of work, which was peace building, and to some degree using mediation as a case in point, being that quite often where there were conflicts, outsiders would arrive with a proposal for what I call a prescription for how to do better at what you were doing. And in so doing, they often, without fully recognizing it, they were bringing certain biases from their own culture and context. They were often behaving in sort of colonial behavior, even though they would have said they're not. They were devaluing quite often what was already available, so much so that sometimes it was invisibilized to the degree that they were crashing through the resources and destroying them in order to try to build something that wasn't there. And by virtue of that, it often collapsed. These were all a part of that critique applied to what I referred to as the elicitive and prescriptive spectrum, not one or the other, but kind of a range of things. Prescription being you bring an already existing model, you tell people how to do it. It's like a recipe. Elicitive, not actually a word in English that we had to try to get the dictionaries to take on, which is more of a Freirean view that you build with and from what people understand of their context and how they're responding, and that they become participants in the critical aspect. What's working, what's not, what do we innovate, what do we need, where are our gaps? So there's much more of that building up and reflecting on what people do naturally that is equally, if not quite often, far more valuable in terms of a knowledge. So my first trips to Northern Ireland, actually at the request of Brendan McAllister and Joe Campbell, who were working in community, was precisely in that direction. They were interested in saying, we've been receiving, and to our benefit, approaches that people from outside of here are suggesting. How help us understand how we build on what it is we know and have here, because that's not been the angle that was used to date, and that was for me it was extraordinary. Here, as we move to the current one, so I'll just give an example. I'm great privilege to work with some wonderful colleagues in the 8th Ward of what's called the Far East Collaborative in Washington, D.C., which is a very challenging setting. People under deep levels of poverty, a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, issues with health and housing. The health COVID crisis has just unveiled the level that our systems have not attended to people of color in equal ways of those of us who have far more privilege. And a lot of what we're looking at is a combination precisely of this, goes all the way back to those basic points that I just made. That is, people, so they will say that if you want to understand what's happening in violence prevention, you can't just kind of blanket a whole, even our little 8th Ward. You have to know almost street by street who's who and what's what. You have to have people that can move fluidly. So people that are returning citizens from incarceration are often the best folks for navigating in violence prevention, but they have no formal degrees and they have very little support for the work they do as activists, and they have enormous challenges around formal credibility. So we're asking questions, how do we proceed to develop the building of the knowledge of what their wisdom brings, along with ways that it can potentially receive more formal acknowledgement and recognition, along with the support that's needed, and not differentiating between whether this is peace building, housing, or health. In other words, people at the bottom up don't, these are not categories they're looking at. They're looking at life. And that life is what they're trying to figure out. And what you find quite often is that they're surviving, but more than surviving, they're often finding ways to thrive. But in that thriving, there is a deep call for let us be seen, and please find ways to come alongside what it is. I mean, one of them, Abdu, was in a conversation I had on a webinar about a month ago. You know, he was making a critique to the whole of the peace building field and he said, you know, we don't need you guys to show up. We need you to show up amazing. And I think what he meant was you just don't get it. And you have to get yourselves sorted out. And I think that's what that book was about. I think we have a long ways to go. I'm happy to have some opportunity, but there are other parts of me that regrets that I didn't, you know, in the personal, so didn't find ways of engaging much deeper, much earlier, much longer. But I think it's coming now. Our reckoning is here.
The day of
I don't know if that's
reckoning
what
always
you were
comes.
after, Gladys, or not, but that's a few observations.
I can see a lot of questions coming in. So while I could ask you questions all day, I want to make sure others have their chance. So I'm going to come to Professor Dominic Bryan first. So Dominic, if you would like to turn on your camera microphone and ask Professor Lederach your question.
Here he comes.
Hello, Professor. My question was, sorry, you can't have my mic on. Yeah, can you hear me?
I
Yes.
got you.
My question was, people of faith are often active in working for reconciliation and conflict resolution in wider society. But today, some of the denominations they come from are deeply hurting, with many individuals sinned against and feeling alienated from the church, with others maybe like myself remaining but not knowing how to contribute to healing and reconciliation. Have you any wisdom for us?
Yeah. And Dominic, just to be clear on the question, it's about the challenge of how to work with people that have been harmed or injured by the church itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but plus also church folks who remain and feel a bit powerless about how to help in that process of reconciliation and healing.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I think there is not any body of religious affiliation that has not created internal harm. So it's not as if one group or another has it sorted. And it remains, I think, one of our biggest challenges because, you know, long ago, one of the Old Testament prophets had this extraordinary phrase when asked, it was Zechariah, what is this wound that you carry? And the response was, it's the wound I received in the heart of my home. So he points to his heart and he says, the wound that I received at home, you know. So wounds that we have that are from communities that should have been communities of protection and safety, but where we've experienced great harm, are often at a very deep level some of the hardest to navigate. You're asking for specific pieces of advice. It's complex because it can change by way of context and situation. But I think if there were one or two guideposts, it would be never try to tackle everything at once. start where you have access. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the Old English verb befriend. Rebuild, even if it's one friendship, without demand or recipe, with openness and transparency, with acknowledgement if that's needed of what's wrong, with as much vulnerability as can be brought to that. And the third is that these, I think, inevitably require different and deeper forms of listening. So I think in my case, one of the greatest phrases that ever captured that was from Saint Benedict, which is the first step of the Benedictine folks, is that you learn to listen with the ear of the heart. So the ability to sit with the ambiguity, the patience to stay with it, the listening, and the reaching to where it is that you have access. If more of us did even a few of those, I think there would be avenues that could begin to emerge. Then that gets coupled with a second piece, which is the harder one in some ways, which is how to speak clearly and as directly as we can in as wide a collective voice as we can to the church as a wider system, where it has fallen short to demand accountability and transparency, I think is without a doubt required. And that has been harder because often that is seen as a betrayal. And, you know, Zachariah's actual terms was the wounds I received in the house of a friend was a betrayal, right? But it's not a betrayal. It is what we could refer to as integrity, wanting to learn to live into what it is that we aspire to be requires us to do that collectively. And our organizational structures are a representation of who we are choosing to be in the world. And I think that requires a collective effort. That's a harder one, but again, it may be in the direction of where you have access. How do you start with your particular denominational, congregational access point? Where can that reach? But that, I think, combines this notion that this work is always personal and systemic. If healing is to have a deeper authenticity to what it means.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I'm going to stay with the theme of religion for one more question. So a PhD student who is identified as Oberbrazen, I'll be calling on you next, but I just want to apologize to Dominic Breen. I read Dominic Bryan instead of Dominic Breen, so I misidentified you as you were introduced, so apologies for that. And now over to you.
Go ahead.
Is it me? Sorry, you're asking.
It's you, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, it keeps cutting out, so I keep missing bits of speech. So, as a PhD candidate researching in the field of conflict transformation, when people ask me about what drives my academic interests, I'm always really nervous to mention the influence of my faith. I come from a Christian background. I've always been inspired that you embrace, this background in your work. So what advice would you have to someone nervous about being open about their faith in relation to their academic work?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? And I'm not sure of your name because I see a name that I am not sure is the name, but what's your name, please?
Olivia.
Olivia, thank you for your question. Olivia, so it's a bit of a paradox. I think I often I carry some critique from within my own community that I don't speak enough in that direction. And often that critique means I'm not saying the words they want me to say that are the right formulas, because I'm kind of an anarchist in my faith in a lot of ways. I have buckled against the religious lingo that seems to provide such formulaic approaches to deep, deep problems. So I don't go there quite. So I don't wear my faith on my sleeve in that way. That's one part of the paradox. The other part is I have learned over and again that what people want is authenticity. They want honesty. They want realness. They don't want something that isn't real. So quite often in the academic world, not that Gladys and all my good friends out there that are professors is, please take all I'm saying with a grain of salt, but the academic world protects itself a lot by hiding behind a capacity for intellectualizing, disembodying knowledge from humanity, from our humanness. And, you know, that shows up in all kinds of things. We defend a PhD, right? So now you suddenly have to put on some kind of boxing gloves and duke it out with people. And you're doing that at the head level. You're just going to go at it, right? But that often is an escapist mechanism that people experience as not being authentic. I can remember I had a great, wonderful colleague, and he and I co-taught a course. He was considered one of the great intellectuals of our time that I was co-teaching with, right? We sat in a class, and one evening in that class, he told a personal story. And he went deep, and it brought tears. And the students, I'm telling you, years and years later are still saying they have never experienced a deeper moment of learning. To see the protection of the intellectualism brought down to the humanity. So for me, being transparent is speaking from the best that I can, who I actually am, and just living and being that, showing up to the degree that I can, not fragmented, but whole. I don't try to leave parts of myself at home when I go into a classroom. I don't try to leave parts of myself at home when I go into a discussion with a political leader. I try to bring the wholeness of my humanity to that. That transparency has actually, in some circumstances, been critical for people in reference to trustworthiness. I'll give you an example. In the first conversation I ever had with one of the armed movements in the Philippines, where I was to deliver a week-long seminar on negotiations, stopped for a full day at the very beginning because one of them said, "We understand that you're Mennonite." That was part of the connection, how I got to them was through Mennonite connections. And they said, "You Mennonites are pacifists. We carry guns, and we want to know what that means." And I think in essence, what they were saying was, are you here to judge us? Are you here to somehow sneak in and do things that we aren't willing? So we had a full-blown conversation. And they were actually quite literate with a lot of things that I wouldn't have expected them to be literate with. But if I had come at that with a lack of transparency, it would have shown up. The same is true, I think, in a religious dialogue. You're not watering down who you are in order to open a relationship with someone else. You're bringing your full self in honesty and vulnerability. And when those relationships develop, they will develop on the basis that they can sustain themselves with a greater level of trust and respect than if you had tried to hide parts of you that weren't there. So I don't always kind of land that into my books directly. I often speak in ways that can be understood depending on the audience that I'm with. But I certainly have felt that it's been significant to find ways to stay with integrity of who I am and what I believe with.
I think John Paul's cut out there, Gladys.
think we've lost John Paul for a minute there. Let's we'll just hang here and hope he comes back. It's his screen has frozen. We lost you for a minute, John Paul. Your free screen froze. So if you could just continue from the part where you said you've learned to have integrity in yourself for those moments.
Integrity, by integrity, I mean that you recognize when what you're doing has a kind of a fragmentation to it. So holding to that in a way that you bring fully yourself to what is there, but you don't impose it by any means. And I think that requires a certain level of vulnerability, but actually that vulnerability often leads to what I think are what people most desire, which is more honest conversations.
Thanks very much, Olivia, for that question and for bringing that out. And we're next going to go to Madison Clark.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been wonderful so far. So my question, I work with youth, usually in creative writing spaces. And so considering the United States' continued devaluation and defunding of arts programs, especially in public education, and then also accompanied by our constant resistance to any potential processing of all of the systemic oppression that the entire country is founded upon, what do you sort of see as the country's way forward, especially now considering the legacy of Trump? We've got the recent insurrection tracing all the way back, even considering Islamophobia after 9/11, et cetera. What do you kind of see as next steps?
Wow. Madison, that's a big question. So let me say that the what you just described, and quite well described actually, points to one of the things that we know for certain, which is that we're dealing with a mix of very complex systems. So complexity sits at the fore. And I think what we've learned about complexity is that there are multiple facets and avenues by which that complexity can be nudged toward more vicious or more virtuous cycles, for those who study complexity theory would often articulate. So that argues in the direction of a greater interdependence of things that need to be in conversation with each other, but that no one person or initiative or element is going to hold the secret sauce for changing it all. So don't try to search for the secret that if only we did this, everything would be taken care of. So I think, what you described points exactly the direction. I would go back to what I said earlier for the person that was asking about local congregations. It has a similarity to it. Start with what you have access to. I don't think we're going to get perfect answers from the top down. We may get perfect storms from the top down, but we're not going to get perfect answers from the top down. So let's start where we have access and keep reaching one step out. Kind of work toward improbability. If you're meeting with the same people over the same things all the time, just try to get out of that bubble just enough that it goes, whether that's across a religion, across a race, across a different part of town, or into a different level of the mayor's office or something that you never tried to ask something. Just ask, what do I have access to? The principle of accessibility. And just take it one step further. Take one risk at a time in the direction of opening up something that you don't fully have access to now, precisely with what you're bringing to it. That is an eye to asking, what's the construct? I use the word transformation because I want to keep at the center, not that we're solving a particular problem, but that we're trying to understand the long journey of what change will require of us. The second is stay in touch with people that are doing stuff that's different, because that can be really helpful. It may not be that you're going to jump over and start doing, I don't know, maybe becoming a sophisticated lawyer doing discrimination cases in housing in the United States or something along that line. But stay in touch with folks that are moving in different, because the system helps to inform different pieces of what's happening. And I think that both, that argues in the direction of an appreciative rather than a kind of a perfection approach. Appreciative would mean, and I'm not using it in appreciative inquiry standards. See, I'm simply saying to appreciate that there are other parts of things happening in the system that give us light and insight into something that may inform parts of what we're doing, or that may create a small bridge into something that's going on. The third, I think we've got some really big issues. One of the most, the biggest one for me, I'll be honest, is how fast and furious the current world of social media makes the capacity for alternative worlds to be constructed. And I'm not sure that we're fully capable of understanding the pace at which some of that coheres. I think we've got a long ways to go around guns. We have, it's embedded in a constitutional mandate, but it has reached a standard that is, gun sales in America have exponentially exploded since the first quarantine lockdown in March. Start tracking an understanding of how that's happening and why. What is the fear that people have? Because we know from our studies that where guns are accumulated, they have a higher likelihood of being used. So we've got a big set of issues on that side. And then we've got a big set of divides, 74 and 80 million just in the half of the country that voted. And you can never use a number like 74 million or 81 million people and not understand that this is about complexity and diversity. So be cautious with using they. Just take note of, if your impulse is to blame somebody or some group, take one step back and say, 74 million, there's got to be some hand I can reach out to that I have access to. Let me begin there. And I think that, the phrase that I've been using is every day wake up, we can do better today. So what is it that today offers opportunity to take one step better? Because, and my final one, plan on a lifetime. So this is not like we're going to get this taken care of yesterday or between now and 2022. So plan on a lifetime, which means think about what persistence requires, think about what patience requires, think about what brings you joy, what renews you. Build those into your life, because if you don't, you're going to burn. And the last thing we need is good people with interesting ideas who are burnt out. And I think that's going to be something incumbent upon all of us to find. And if I conclude, I'm going to conclude with the single shortest phrase of the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King Jr. We cannot do it alone. If you go back to the I Have a Dream speech, you'll find where it's located. It's a very interesting notion. So keep connected.
Thanks for that. I mean, that was a big question, and I mean, you brought the complexity out really well, and bring the time scale, and I think was important. And also, I think goes back to that point you made earlier about these things not being a linear process as well. So the next person we have lined up is Kevin Brenneman.
Hi, thanks for this event. It's wonderful. My question was, do you have any experiences or strategies when working on a conflict situation and you realize that some of the actors are actually bad faith actors, or really have no desire for some sort of a transformation to take place?
Yeah, Kevin. So the answer is yes, about 90% of the time. But I want to qualify that a lot. What's perceived as bad faith are often mechanisms of safety and protection. And so I think the approach is not to perceive or interpret it as pure bad faith, but to ask the question, how did one arrive at something that created a world so precarious that trust was no longer even feasible? And so it begs always the question of how do we build little by little more trustworthy forms of engagement with each other. That doesn't mean always, so when you use a phrase like rebuilding toward a trustworthiness, if you will. It's a little different than just rebuilding trust. People aren't just going to trust, and often they'll do things that you can perceive as walking away from what they had committed to, and sometimes it actually was premeditated. But more often than not, when it happens, I find that that comes from a landscape, basically, in the background of things that have been a long pattern of feeling like they have very few options, very few possibilities, and very little incentive to trust. And so there are elements you can work toward in that direction. I wrote in the Moral Imagination, I had a title. In fact, I think Gladys might have wanted to ask about this earlier, but it was The Gift of Pessimism. And I know that I'm a kind of optimistic person by nature. You don't stay very long in this work if you don't have some sense that there are continuous ways to find something on, in a movement in a direction that is more constructive. But the gift of pessimism was that the gift is that you have an unveiling that helps you understand better the realities that you're dealing with. So in some regards, when things fall apart, and they fall apart, and even if you perceive that it was intentional and premeditated and almost, evil-like in intention, iniquity in essence, that's the perception. The gift of that is that it brings you down to the ground of where it is that things have to be built from. So then you're facing the question, so what did we learn? What if it emerged again might be needed that wasn't here this time? Who was missing? And what were the ways in which I contributed in some form or fashion to this being the outcome? Those become, I think, the gift of pessimism is that it makes it possible for you to hit the raw reality better, rather than dealing with something that's not real. And if we know anything about fantasy worlds right now, is that fantasy worlds are pretty dangerous. And we got quite a few of them floating around. Some people say it's Looney Tunes and we're all looking for exit stage right somehow. So the gift of pessimism in some ways is a part of this. It grounds you down to, okay, this is where it's at. So what do we understand about it? I certainly function from the standpoint that almost all of the time, that doesn't take interdependence out of the equation. Meaning that even if that person, those people did this thing, who they are and what they do still remains a part of the wider interdependence of the well-being of our collective. So it's not like we can ignore or that they're somehow miraculously going to disappear. So what that gift of pessimism offers is, boom, okay, we're better grounded. Let's take a careful look. Let's reflect on what we have experienced, what we have seen, and what we know. And then ask the questions, what are the steps? And they will vary in every context.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah, it's the long journey, yeah, and constantly checking back to see what we could do better. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that. I think in Northern Ireland, we're particularly well gifted in terms of pessimism. And but there was another point I wanted to follow up at your answer to Madison. You mentioned the danger of burning out. So we have a question coming from Trevor Williams. I think that will help you draw out and address that a bit more.
Thank you, John Paul. One of the things I've learned from you is that peace is a long road. And the question is, how do you stick that pace, if you like? How do you measure yourself without burnout, you've mentioned before? How does one look after yourself as peacemaker?
Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. It's a wonderful question. It actually is one that I have in my earlier years. It was not a question that others placed before me. So I think it's really significant. My view from where I am now is that this is something that ought to be placed before all of us from the earliest age possible that we get engaged in this kind of work. I had to come through periods of burnout to understand what was happening. So I think one of the things that comes with that is a recognition of the signs of when it's showing up, and it will usually show up in your body in some form or fashion. Fatigue, tiredness, edginess that kicks, inappropriately, but also a kind of a wearing down of your wells of compassion. And so one of the things that I've worked toward is asking 2 or 3 questions that I just kind of keep coming back to, and to the degree possible, make them a bit more daily than every 5 years a retreat, which I don't think is a great formula for it. So that the one is, what brings you joy? Because if you can find ways to let things that you really enjoy into your life closer to a daily basis. It could be walking, it could be a garden, it could be working with a bit of wood, could be writing a poem, it could be taking a half hour to read a book, could be just sitting in the sun, if you've ever have that possibility up there where you're all hanging out. So yeah, but it's, it varies by people, but where you recognize something that brought you joy in your life, try to let it back in. Because I think that opens up avenues that are replenishing. The second is pay, I think, more attention to the body. What all the studies have shown us over the years, and increasingly so now, is that we carry trauma in the body, not in the head. We think trauma is mostly a head thing. It's mostly a body thing. And so everyone will have their own personal approaches to this, but over the years, I've done a lot more in the direction of walking, biking, forms of stretching or exercise that are helpful. Just, small things. One of the things I discovered about walking is how prevalent it was among people who walked as they were being creative. You could name dozens of them that had different forms by which this happened. Darwin renownedly was a person who, when stuck with an issue that he was writing on, would go on a walk that was a loop where he lived. And before he started that walk, he would stack rocks up 5, 6, 7 high. And every time one loop completed, he'd knock one rock off. And then he would refer to that issue he was mulling as a 6-rock problem. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that was the anecdote that I heard. It's quite revealing, actually, that somehow the physical movement, it releases endorphin. There's a range of things that people can explain physiologically, but these are connected to replenishing, but also creativity. So how you find little ways that happens. I had little formulas when I was a teacher. I won't pretend that any of the teachers out there are going to take this on, but I decided for the last 4 or 5 years that I taught that office hours, which in our case in the United States meant the hour in the week that a student could ask for a meeting or an appointment. The office hours I put right in my syllabus were X and Y, but if you want an office hour, write me, and I would prefer to go on a walk with you. So I actually started walking with all of my students. And those were, for me, replenishing and powerful. And I had students that some years later would write me, because where I was at on the campus of Notre Dame, there were 2 lakes on the campus. And if the issue they needed to talk only required 1 lake, they would write. But if it required 2, they would also write, and they say, I need a 2-lake walk. So it became a thing that was like, it kind of opened a different space. When you walk with somebody, you're shoulder to shoulder, you're looking out the same direction, you're in often connection to nature, which I think is a very powerful replenisher. You get re-grounded, but you have a physical activity right alongside of the conversational one. And I think there are a lot of things that we could just keep asking yourself, what is it that might make something that I'm doing regularly not only more joyful, but more creative and more replenishing? And I don't know what those would be for everyone, but I think where they become daily or weekly, they become much more powerful of an antidote against burnout than when they aren't present and when you're not conscious of it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and what strikes me about that answer is it actually requires a great deal of discipline to do that and to build that into your everyday life. And I think that's important. So we're coming to the last 10 minutes of John Paul's time with us. We've got a question lined up from Annette Feldman, which will be our last question from the floor. And then we'll finish it up with one more question from me. So Annette, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lederach, thank you so much for having this event. Actually, Kevin, who was on earlier, he and I, we studied peace, conflict, and development together in Spain at the Jaume I University, and you are kind of a hero there. So it's really an honor. And I specialized in looking at gender studies in peace. So now, being a youth worker here in Northern Ireland in Belfast, I would like to know, so if we acknowledge that the different genders experience trauma, conflict in a different way, and if we then acknowledge that also their healing process possibly goes a different path in a different way, so how do we take your aesthetic approach into consideration with gender? So in my practice, I often find when I work mostly with young women, but when I work with young men, they're often reluctant towards my approaches, or they find other mediums more appealing. But if we then think of, okay, these are the activities for young women and these are the activities for young boys, I don't find that very productive. So how can we work towards a more integrated approach?
Yeah. Well, it's terrific, Annette. Thank you. And I very much appreciate the program you're at. I had a chance to visit there one or two times way back when. I don't have an easy recipe answer for this, so I just can speculate on my own experiences.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a constant. Basically, the answer is, I don't know. Be as creative as you can, and keep experimenting. What I've found goes very close to what I just was talking to Trevor about, to be honest. I've incorporated, so where obviously I've had some advantages over the last decade or so in that I'm traveling a bit less, but I do bring people together who come my direction sometimes, and they're in the form of more of a retreat format, which I prefer over a workshop format. I've kind of navigated away from capacity building, skill building, workshop stuff, and much prefer kind of an open-ended retreat that has always more than one avenue by which people can participate. So early morning walks, periods of just sitting and writing whatever comes, one-on-one walks. I've incorporated a lot of these retreats. I will incorporate working with small wood pieces. There's a tradition within our wider field, and certainly drawn from some of the indigenous traditions, of when you're working at a conversation in a circle, you may have a talking piece, and you may have experienced that. So I have these things that I'm going to show you a few. These are talking sticks that came out of workshop, came out of these retreats. And what we do is we go to a woods and everybody kind of picks a piece, and everybody goes on their own pace with their, so it's got a lot of metaphoric levels to it. You're often peeling back bark, you're revealing color, you're sanding and smoothing, you're polishing, or you're leaving it rough. It may speak to you. But men and women, what I find is that some of that has, so when you find something that opens up a space, you aren't always sure how each person is going to navigate that by way of, might be gender, but might be age, it might be trauma that they personally have experienced. But what it does do is that it permits a journey, a mini, M-I-N-I, a small journey alongside of that. And then the reason for the walking precisely was this side-by-side thing. This notion of being able to be in a place where not everything has to be said in an open group, where things that people are struggling to find words for can be said with very little cost, meaning that they can blurt what they want, or they can wander, they can talk for a half an hour straight without stopping, or they can be silent for a long period and then just say one sentence. Now, whether that varies by a gender, I'm certain there are elements that are there. I certainly have tried, when I've had opportunity, to always create modalities of co-facilitation and an equal number of men and women. There are times where, for very concrete purposes like what you described, it is only one or the other, and that has its own. But I think if I had anything, it would be find ways actually that people engage in something that permits them to concentrate but have a wandering mind. Find ways that you permit a kind of an alongsideness that opens toward things that they're trying to get to that they may not know fully how to express. Create as much safety as possible, obviously, within that. And be humble. Don't assume too much. Be humble means, plan to learn. Because I don't know if your field of inquiry is brilliant, fantastic. We have so much more that we have to sort through on what this has meant in so many different ways and so many different places. So it's like a massive, vast field that you're walking into. That should bring a smile onto your face. Think of all the walks you're going to have with this one. That would be where I'm at with that kind of thing. I just don't believe much in rote recipes. I believe in figuring out things that open to the humanity of people, no matter who we're with.
Great. I'll tell that to my line manager tomorrow.
Good luck.
Well, thanks very much to that. And we're coming up to 1:30. So I just wanted to end, I suppose, with one last opportunity for you, John Paul, to give us a final lesson or insight or word of wisdom based on, your decades of experience as an academic and practitioner, and thinking of all the complex issues we've discussed today facing the field of conflict transformation. Is there anything in particular you would just like to leave us with going forward?
Well, a number of these last ones, you kind of caught some of the edge of my own thinking, certainly. In the big picture of our field, to me, this is a really significant century we're in. When COVID came forward, when George Floyd came forward, I think many of us experienced a kind of a moment of really deep reckoning here in the US that's still obviously going forward. I found myself saying, why wasn't this better taken care of in the 60s? And then I discovered myself saying, which 60s? Because immediately I was thinking of the civil rights movement that I had grown up as a very young adolescent in the early parts of it, into that period when was significant here in the United States. But the 1960s was the civil rights movement. 1860s was our Civil War. 1760s was the period that led into our Constitution. What's 2060 going to be? Is this not the century? Can we not find a way to come at this better? At a time when COVID has taught us that we're connected and interdependent, and there is no escape from the fact that we are a global family. None. That we are depleting the fundamental resources of our planet, and that we are treating too many of us horribly. So I think our field has to broaden considerably a number of things. I have for some years been concerned about an overemphasis on the metaphor of the table and negotiations, and by virtue of that, some form of representation, which I think will be weak in addressing any of these, because it sort of requires a reducing down to a few to speak on behalf of the whole. So we need more differentiated and better models of participation. And I think that actually needs to take a turn toward the local, that we have to engage much more significantly with multiplicities of people engaged where they live, and not relying as much as we have on waiting for the perfect solution to be brought down. And where that has been weak, good solutions have collapsed anyway. So I think, our field, not exclusively, but a lot of our field has been defined by the metaphor of the table. And I think maybe this is the century that we need to evolve a different set of metaphors. Walking is one of those. That would take me longer to explain, but it has to do, for any of you that want to look it up, with stigmergy. That may sound very bizarre, but it was the study in entomology, principally, study of insects that are collectives, where the key paradoxical question that was posed is, how did whole collectives make decisions without relying on a hierarchy? And what they found was that it was through thousands of points where a scent, S-C-E-N-T, was left in the landscape that a termite or an ant would follow on. So it had to do with moving around conversations and leaving a scent. And I think there's something to be said for our capacity to constantly move within our communities and then beyond them, to evolve better ways to develop both the power of the local, but the power of the capacity to connect and really mobilize around interdependence. I'll stop there, Gladys. Thank you very much, and greetings to all of you. I couldn't see who all was on, but I'm sure there are a number of friends, so I'm sending you warm wishes.
Well, thank you very much, John Paul, and thanks again to the Mitchell Institute for the support of this event. We're really grateful that you set the agenda for us now for the rest of the century, so we'll take that away with us. So thanks very much.